All right. Professor George Yancy, professor of philosophy at Emory University, a respected scholar and intellectual, a black man, has written a letter, Dear White America. As I have it printed up in front of me, it is, 4 or 5 pages long. And I want to interact with this letter. Let me first say this. I am not claiming to be this perfectly balanced individual that could not possibly have a trace of bias or racism or blind spots within me. To think that way would be arrogant. At the same time, as I've ministered around the world, as I've interacted with people from so many different races, backgrounds, ethnicities, and as I've listened for over 7 years now to my listeners, I've listened to you, my listeners, as you have called in and given me input. And we've talked through the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman issues. We've talked through the shooting of my namesake, Michael Brown. We've talked through perceptions of race with President Obama. We've talked through difficult, divisive issues, and we've learned from each other with the principle of let's talk straight enough that if we offend each other, fine, but let's do it with respect and let's learn from each other. I have certainly learned much, and I certainly do not deny the presence of racism in America in some systemic ways. I don't deny that. And my wife, Nancy, has often said to me, it's very difficult, must be very difficult to grow up as a black in America. Not for all, but for many. So I'm the last person to downplay this or to deny it. At the same time, I believe, and I've said this repeatedly, that there are blind spots I see in white America and in black America. Speaking broadly, white Americans often tend not to see racism when it is there. Black Americans often tend to see racism when it isn't there. And that's where we have to listen to each other and learn from each other as much as possible. Now, look, I did not grow up in the midst of a totally ethnically mixed community on Long Island. But what's interesting is my first organ teacher when I was not even 7 years old was an openly gay man. And he and his gay partner would often come together. The gay partner was a beautician, stereotypical, that was the case. And they would come, and sometimes when the one would come to teach us, Russell was his name, and his partner Ed, they'd come and stay over for dinner. He'd teach me, teach my sister, and then they'd stay for dinner and hang out with my family. Then my next organ teacher was a black man married to a white woman. And I remember my father telling us about how they lost friends and how ugly it was that people turned against them because it was wrong for a black to be married to a white. So I grew up in that environment, okay? And I grew up in an environment that really intentionally went against some of the color barriers that existed. So it's from that vantage point that I speak, not claiming to be free of biases or hidden blind spots, but saying that I reject some of the premises about, well, it's just in you just have to recognize the racism. So Professor Yancy writes, Dear White America, I have a weighty request as you read this letter. I want you to listen with love, a sort of love that demands that you look at parts of yourself that might cause pain and terror. He said, we don't talk much about the urgency of love these days, especially within the public sphere. Much of our discourse these days is about revenge, name-calling, hate, and divisiveness. And he's saying, look, I want to talk about real love that's scary, that really makes you ask hard questions. Hey, Professor Yancy, I'm right with you on that. He said, this letter is a gift for you. Bear in mind, though, that some gifts can be heavy to bear. Hey, I'm with that, too. It says in the Bible, open rebuke is better than secret love. It says in the Bible that he who rebukes a man in the end will find more favor than the one who speaks with a flattering tongue. So I'm all for speaking the truth in love, even when it makes us uncomfortable. Yancy then is being self-analytical and says, what if I told you that I'm sexist? He said, well, I am. And he's just convinced that as a male that he is sexist in many ways and works to keep women in a bad place or benefits from his superiority and that somehow he is sexist. And he says, as a sexist, I've failed women. He said, I've been fed a poisonous diet of images that fragment women into mere body parts. Oh, okay. Let's just focus on that for a minute. I've been fed that same diet. I see the scantily clothed gals in an ad on the internet. It's like, what's this got to do with a sports column I'm reading or some news item in preparation for the show? I'm checking out of the same grocery store as you are, and there's every lady just got to be some sex image. I've said for years that's degrading to women. Yeah, I can have to avert my eyes and watch my eyes because as a male, I can be drawn to those things and want to look at them. So I look away to honor the Lord and be holy and to honor my wife. But I don't look at women as sexual objects. I don't relate to women in that way. And my wife is the most esteemed human being in my world. So I'm not sure that I just buy into the rhetoric here that we qualify a male as a sexist based on the definitions you give. I'm just excerpting here because there's no time to read your whole letter. But now we get to the image of racism, the issue of racism. And you're right, Professor Yancy, don't tell me that you voted for Obama. Oh, I didn't. I would have liked to, but because of his extreme liberal stance, I couldn't. Don't tell me that you don't see color. Well, I see it, but it doesn't mean anything to me. Of course I see it, but it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything if I'm teaching a white student or a black student. It doesn't mean anything if I'm ministering with a white friend or a black friend in terms of our unity in Jesus, in terms of how these things transcend all of that. Oh, yeah, I see color in that. I much prefer preaching in a black church than a white church because of a certain black tradition that talks back to the preacher more than the white church that just sits sometimes. Oh, yeah, and if that's racial stereotyping, well, fine, but it's a positive one to me. But color doesn't matter, and maybe it's the bloodline that we talk about in Jesus, how the bloodline washes color away and how we're one. And when you minister in as many different nations as I do and listen to people from different perspectives, it does color, forgive the word, color your thinking. Don't tell me that I'm blaming whites for everything. I'm not saying you're doing that, sir, but here's what I struggle with. You say, if you're white reading this letter, I ask you that you don't run to seek shelter from your own racism. Don't hide from your responsibility. You're writing to white America, sir. If you call all of white America racist, you're in error. Your exaggerated point steals away from the good constructive things you're seeking to do with a gentle spirit. I can see your anger. I can see that this letter is being misunderstood by some, but by many it's being rightly understood, and there's no anger in me. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I think you've got wrong premises. I think you're buying into wrong worldviews and mindsets. Listen, if I walk into a store and I'm not racially profiled, I don't have to feel guilty for that. I don't have to feel bad about that, nor do I have to say, well, I built that society on the backs of black people who are being racially profiled. No, I want to address the racial profiling of blacks. I want to address any inequity in our society. I want to address issues of justice. I want to address problems in the inner city, especially where it does affect black America. And that's America's problem together. Yes, we want to address these things together. But I'm not going to feel guilty if I'm not racially profiled or somehow think that I'm being racist for not being racially profiled. Of course not. Of course not. As you reap comfort for being white, we suffer for being black and people of color. I'm not reaping comfort for being white. I'm a follower of Jesus, and I get ridiculed as a follower of Jesus day and night, whether I'm white or black. I'm a Jewish follower of Jesus. I get opposed from my Jewish community as a Jew who believes in Jesus. And then around the world, I'm not identifying with whites. I'm identifying with other Christians who are having their heads chopped off for being Christians. And look, if black Americans built society in such a way that there was no racial profiling of blacks, but there was of whites, and that doesn't mean you're deriving comfort from being a black. It means that's the society that's being built. Somehow, blacks and whites, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, we've got to listen to each other, find out the systemic problems that do exist in our society, and find out how to address them constructively without painting with such a broad brush that now makes me read this and have to disqualify so much of what you are saying, sir. Some of you white brothers and sisters, some of your white brothers and sisters have made this leap, and the leap is quoting now legal scholar Stephanie M. Wildman, who's written, I simply believe that no matter how hard I work at not being racist, I still am. I don't accept that. I don't accept that. I don't accept that I have to admit to being racist if I'm not in order to somehow prove that I'm really an enlightened listening person. I think that's part of the problem, and we see it with some of the extreme movements on our campuses now and the whole microaggression and this offends me stuff. Come on. We've got to do better. So look, I'm all for hearing out each other in love. I'm all for listening and learning. But stop painting with the ridiculously broad brush. It's unhelpful. It's harmful more than it's helpful. And it moves past constructive discussion and puts people on the defense.